Okay, so the Bohr and shell model of the atom, there's some problems with it. It doesn't work, which we've seen from the PES data. Remember that the Bohr model is the one where we draw the nucleus in the middle and those electrons just surrounding it in orbitals. So if we sketch a picture, just so we can look at it while we're talking. So here's an example. This would be the shell model. We've got the electrons just orbiting around the nucleus. And the basic setup is correct. We have the nucleus as the center region, positively charged with protons and neutrons, and the electrons out here in the electron cloud. But as far as where everything is a little bit different with the electrons. So what the Bohr model said then was that this electron, that one, and that one are all the same. There's no difference between those 5 electrons. And we see, though, from the PES data, that isn't the case. When we look at the data, we would see for that last row of electrons something like this. Okay, we would get a spot with a higher peak, and that would represent 3 electrons, and then we would get a smaller peak that would represent 2 electrons. So according to the Bohr model, we shouldn't see that. We should just have one peak that represents 5 electrons because they're all the same distance from the nucleus, they all have the same shielding, and so therefore they would have the same force according to Coulomb's law. So this did baffle scientists for a little bit, but they came up with a new model of the atom called the quantum mechanical model, and that separates electrons into subshells within the shells. So instead of just having one shell around there, there's different shells within that shell to represent the different spaces that electrons can be. Okay, so the quantum mechanical model, which is the more modern one, says that electrons do not follow orbits, so they're not just circling around the nucleus like planets. Instead, they have a wave function, and a wave function is a way to describe an electron's possible positions in 3-dimensional space, and that's often what we call an orbital. So whenever I talk about orbital, we're talking about that wave function idea, and that'll be the word that we use the most often. So then the possible wave functions include all of these different ones that we've talked about. So 1s, 2s, 4p, 4d, and all of those up to 7f right now. So then every electron under one of these labels in a given atom is at the same quantized energy level. So that means the 1s electrons might be different than the 2s, and the 2s different than the 2p, but all the electrons in the 2p are going to be identical. They're going to have the same amounts of energy. Okay, so they're going to be shielded the same, they're going to be the same distance, therefore the amount of energy taken to ionize those or to remove those is going to be the same for all of them. And like the 2p shell, that can hold 6 electrons, so all 6 of those will be identical as far as energy goes, as far as their quantity of energy. And 4f would have 14 electrons, and all 14 of those electrons are going to be identical as well. But the 4d electrons, and there would be 10 of those, they're going to be different than the 4f electrons. Even though they're in the same range, so they're in the same shell, the 4d electrons would require more energy to remove because they have more shielding than the 4f. So the energy of both of those would be different. All right, here's something really important. The orbital is not a physical structure. So when we talk about the s, the p, the d, the f orbitals, they are not actual things, okay? It's just a region where electrons occupy 90% of the time. So it's the most probable location for an electron at any given point in time. So when we talk about the structures, when we draw the p orbital as something like a dumbbell shape like this, it's not actually a dumbbell shape. It just means that 90% of the time, electrons are found within this region right here. Okay, they could still be out here, but most of the time they're within this area. And they're not necessarily going in some figure 8 like that. They could just be bouncing around right here the whole time, or right there, or just going back and forth. They're just within that area. So here's an example of the 1s subshell. So these right here would be the locations where electrons are found 100% of the time. So we see that electrons are really occupying kind of this large circular region. We do get a few scattered out here and there, but the bulk of them are in here. So if we were to count all the electrons that are out there and figure out where 90% of them are, we would see something like this. Okay, so here is the region then where 90% of the electrons are found in the 1s sublevel. We see it makes that circular shape, and that circular shape is then what we draw typically as the 1s orbital. Okay, so here's the graphic representation of the 1s. So it's not really a circle. It's not that the electrons are just spinning around and around and around. Instead, they're just found within this area somewhere. So you saw the picture before with all the dots. That's just what the electrons are doing. And keep in mind that there's only 2 electrons that would fit in this 1s orbital. So all those dots you saw before, those would just be, if we had those 2 electrons and we kind of tracked and we marked where they were like every second that went past, that's what we would see. So it's not like there's hundreds of electrons in there. Those are just all the locations that the 2 electrons appeared in over time. Okay, so there's 3 2p orbitals. This one right here is the px, and it's the px because it's going on the x-axis if we just think of a graph. And this right here can hold 2 electrons. All orbitals can hold 2 electrons. And since there is 3 2p's, that means the 2p in total can hold 6 electrons. And keep in mind, this isn't a physical shape, so it's not like electrons are just spinning around like this. This just marks the region where 90% of the time, electrons that are in the px orbital will be found. Okay. And here's the py orbital, same thing, it can hold 2 electrons. This isn't an actual path, it's just the region where 90% of the time the electrons are found. They could be out here occasionally or right there, but 90% of the time they're within one of those regions. And then there's the pz orbital, so this is kind of funny to look at, but the py goes up and down, px goes this way, and z it's coming out towards you. So this region right there is coming towards you, then there's a dumbbell shape behind all of this that marks the other half of the pz. And pz can hold 2 electrons, 90% of the time that's where the electrons are.